Okay, so welcome back to the second class on victory over Māra, where we're exploring the story that so many of us have heard in Dharma talks about this battle, quote unquote, with the Buddha to be and Māra. And we'll be exploring a little bit about what it means for us as practitioners, as well as what is our relationship maybe to these stories and the different ways that they show up in the literature, this Buddhist literature. So I'm going to share screen just a little bit to help us stay on the same page. And maybe it's, especially because when I use like Pali words, I know it's so easy to kind of like just be dismissive of them. I know I certainly was before I knew Pali. So here we are in the second class. I just want to do a little bit of a review because part of what I want to do today is to compare what we did last week and this week. And so just a refresher a little bit what we did last week. So I think probably most of us are familiar, just the general arc of this story is I'm calling the Buddha to be. He journeyed to some place around Jara River or the Bodh Gaya and to strive or do his last efforts towards awakening. And there he's confronted by Māra. There's a conflict with Māra, and the Buddha to be overcomes the conflict and becomes awakened. So that's the big, really, 10,000-foot view. This story in early Buddhism is told in different locations or different, I'll say textual locations. The Padana Sutta, translated as Sutta on Striving. This is in the Pali Canon. It's Sutta Nipata 3.2. And then it's also in the Nidana Kata. Maybe I'll just say a tiny little bit here about pronunciation. This letter A with a bar on top, a macron. I know in English when I was like learning, in grade school, learning how to pronounce things, we thought an A back then, in that setting, A with a bar on top, we pronounced it as A. But with Pali, with a bar on top means like it's longer, so it's Māra. So it's Māra. So this A is short and this one is long. So just a little tidbit there on pronunciation. Okay, so it's in the Padana Sutta, the Nidana Kata, which we're going to talk about today, which is not in the Pali Canon, and the Buddha Charita, which is part of this epic poetry tradition. As far as I know, I don't think any other person has talked about this, the Buddha Charita. It's beautiful. I love it. And we'll be talking about that next week. But something about these three different, maybe I'll say, in the Mahayana tradition, they have other versions of this. So I'm just highlighting what's here and for early Buddhism. And then also highlighting not only in the three different textual locations, but they were composed at really different times. Right, here's the Padana Sutta. Scholars like to argue about these exact dates, so I'll hold these lightly. But, here we are. Here's around the time of the Buddha. And then the commentaries, right? This is like, 800 years later. This is a long time, 800 years. And then the Buddha Charita is closer to what's believed to be the time of the Buddha, but still, right? Maybe this is 600 years or something like this. So I just want to put that into perspective. And then last week we talked about this Padana Sutta, and here's just a review of some of the key elements. Before awakening, he stated that he had the 5 faculties. Like, oh, okay. So he didn't list them in the usual order, but there was the 5 faculties. And the Buddha he named Māra's armies. He said, and Māra, you have these armies. And here's a list of 10. Some of these we're familiar with: sensual pleasure, doubt, craving, dullness, and drowsiness. But there's also like gain, praise, honor, hunger and thirst, discontent. So some of these things. So these are the Māra's armies were described using these words. And then it ends, or the Buddha becomes awakened by saying that he's going to destroy Māra's army with wisdom. So that's kind of how it ends. We didn't hear the exact, the Buddha's exclamation of having become awakened, but he says he's going to destroy Māra's army with wisdom. So that's a little review of a bit about what we did last week. And then I want to introduce a new topic, because we're going to compare what's in the suttas with what we're about to read today. So I want to introduce something, and this is, there's a typical way in which the Buddha's awakening gets described. It's with the three knowledges. Some of you might have heard of this. So I'm just going to introduce this as a high level. I could do a whole course on the different ways that awakening gets portrayed and discussed, but I just want to focus on this one right here. So in Majjhima 4, the fear and dread, Abhaya Saraiva or something, sutta, I don't remember the exact Pali, is where this three knowledges is. And some suttas have different portrayals. Well, I'm not going to talk about that. I just don't want to give the impression that it's homogeneous throughout the suttas, because it isn't. And these three knowledges occurs after the Buddha has been in the fourth jhana. So it comes after a meditative state. And he says, when my concentrated mind was malleable, wieldy, steady, and goes on. Here's the first knowledge: recollection of past lives. Maybe you've heard about this, like this idea that was before he became awakened, he remembered all his previous past lives, where he lived, what his name was, I think the food, and I don't know, something else, some characteristic about all these different past lives. The second knowledge was understanding how beings pass on to their next lives according to their actions. So that is essentially, he claimed that he saw, oh, these beings did bad deeds in past lives. So, in the current life, so they're going to be in a bad destination, like an animal realm, a hell realm, or something like this. And those people that did good, or like have a good life this life, it's because they did good deeds in the past. So this linking together of all the ways in which beings get reborn, what causes their rebirth location. So it's quite something, right? This is a lot of emphasis on rebirth. But this is 2 out of the 3 knowledges. So the third knowledge is insight into the Four Noble Truths. Maybe this is something we're more familiar with. I directly knew, as it actually is, this is suffering, this is the origin of suffering, this is the cessation of suffering, and the way leading to the cessation of suffering. This isn't, for many of us, this is familiar, but it's also, this third knowledge also has this destruction of the taints. Taints in Pali is asava. These are a type of defilements: craving for sensual pleasures, craving for existence, and ignorance. So notice how this is the exact same pattern. Up here, this is suffering. Now here it says, these are the taints. This is the origin of the taints. This is the cessation of the taints, and this is the way leading to the cessation of the taints. So scholars speculate, like, okay, what exactly does this mean, this third knowledge and destruction of the taints? We could say it's like just this purification, this no more defilements whatsoever. And not only that, there's a understanding about what causes them to arise and to pass away. So I want to just mention briefly, how do we hold this? Even this, like this whole idea of these 3 knowledges, what are some ways in which we can hold it? Again, scholars have poked around and written a lot about this, and Dharma teachers have talked about this a lot. So I'm just providing some high level overview. There's a lot that we could go into here, but Here's 3 different ways in which we can understand it. 1, that's actually what happened. Okay, but it could just be an actual depiction. 2, alternatively, that the dominant religion of that time, Brahmanism, also had 3 knowledges. They were called 3 Vedas. Some of you might know the Vedas are ancient literature, sacred literature. And so this idea, well, you know, you guys have 3 knowledges, we have 3 knowledges too. You know, it's like this way, but there's this way in which, and we see this a lot in the suttas actually, where the Buddhism and Brahmanism are kind of like compared. And of course, Buddhism is always a little bit better. This just because, right? This is what's getting preserved in Buddhist texts. But then here's a third one, an alternative way that we could interpret these 3 knowledges, is that it's not until we see all the suffering, including, I don't know, maybe I should just say all the suffering. I don't know if it's in previous lives or not, but just see so much suffering, just the first knowledge and the second knowledge is where this person who became the Buddha, all the suffering that he had in previous lives, and all those other beings, how they have suffering and they've ended up in hell realms and things like this. It's not until there's this complete, thorough, deep understanding of, wow, all this suffering, that allows the defilements to cease, which is that third knowledge. It's the third knowledge is seeing suffering and the ending of suffering, and seeing the taints and the ending of the taints. So this is a third way in which we could see the third knowledge here. So this is kind of a lot, but maybe I'll just jump in, or maybe let's say this, I'll see if anybody has some comments. I don't want to talk a lot about the awakening here because, like I said, I did have the idea, maybe I'll just teach a whole course on this, you know, do a few on, there's like interesting stuff in there. So I just, before I kind of, now we're going to shift next to go to the Dāna Kata to talk about Māra. Before I go there, I don't want to leave anybody behind who feels like, wait, what? Okay. Okay, let's see, anybody raising their hands. Okay. So I'm going to read a little bit from the Dāna Kata, and then we'll we'll talk about it a little bit. Okay. This is the introduction to the Jataka tales. Fascinating that this is the first biography in the Pali tradition, and it occurs when the Jataka tales, many of you might know, those are the stories of the Buddha's past lives. And yeah, that's an interesting topic too. Like, where do these stories come from? And I'll just say this, lots of religious traditions share these exact same stories. So it was kind of like it was in what was floating around in ancient India at the time. And, you know, this religion co-opted it and gave it some meaning. This religion took it and did some meaning. Anyway, that's the Jataka tales. So the Dāna Kata is the biography, like, okay, as an introduction to the Buddha's past lives, they do a biography of which includes the life in which he became awakened. Okay. So I want to read a few little bits here to kind of give a sense of what's there. So I'll start with this, the yellow here. The Bodhisattva ascended the platform at the foot of the Bodhi tree and stood on the southern side facing the north. So apparently there's a platform there. At that moment, the southern ridge of the universe sank low and appeared to have reached Avicii, which is a hell. It's the worst hell, the deepest hell. And the northern ridge of the universe was raised upward and appeared to have reached the vault of heaven above. So right, he goes to sit down, the universe just tilts. And the Bodhisattva thought that perhaps it was not the place for the attainment of enlightenment. And going around clockwise direction, he went and stood in the western side facing the east. That doesn't work. Same thing happens. He goes to the next side. That doesn't happen. Let's see here if I can make this so you guys can see. Here we go. Yeah. So finally, he goes to the, he sits on the eastern side. See if I can. The great being, so, and here the great being is the Buddha to be, the Bodhisattva and the great being, those are synonyms here. Having realized that that was the place, that was the stable place, never forsaken by any of the Buddhas, right? So recognizing that there's been Buddhas before him, the seed for the destruction of the aggregate of defilements held those blades of grass at their tips and shook them. So earlier in the story, he had a bundle of grass. And immediately there sprang a seat 14 cubits in extent, and those blades of grass placed themselves in a manner that even the ablest painter or sculptor would not have been able to design. So he tosses these bundles of grass, 14 cubits, 21 feet, we would say, kind of like around. And so this is a lot. It's not like he's just sitting under a tree. 21 feet, right, is this platform. It's this giant platform. So he sits down and he makes this resolve that only my skin, sinews, and bones remain, and let the flesh and blood in my body dry up, but not until I attain the supreme enlightenment will I give up this seat of meditation. So making this resolve. This is part of, what's really famous about this this battle with Māra or something, right? Is how the Buddha to be, he's really adept. He's really not only adept, he's really determined. So, and then, how come I can't? Seems like my computer is not. Here we go. At that time, the Devaputta Māra. So Māra is now a Deva. So in this story, he's elevated and he's a heavenly being. And thinking, Prince Siddhartha, here's the third epithet of the Buddha to be, wishes to go beyond my control, but I will not give him the opportunity of doing so. And he went and announced it to his forces and marched forward with them. So Māra really doesn't want to lose the control. We talked about this last week also. He doesn't want people to leave samsara. And then the Devaputta Māra mounted on the elephant called Girimekala. This Girimekala means like girded by mountains, which was 150 yojanas in height. So a yojana is about 7 miles. So 150 times 7 miles high, right? And 150 in height, armed himself with diverse weapons, creating 1,000 hands. And no two people of the rest of the army carried the same type of weapon. They came in diverse forms, assuming various guises to overwhelm the great being. So this is often when we think about this battle of Māra, we're thinking of this huge army coming towards him. At this time, the deities of the 10,000 world spheres stood around the great being, singing songs in praise of him. So, okay. So Māra has his army. The Buddha to be has these deities. So it feels like it's not just the Buddha and the Māra anymore. Now it feels it's this big cosmic event. When the army of Māra was fast approaching the foot of the Bodhi tree, not one deity among them was able to remain. So they were hanging out, praising the Buddha, being with him, and then Mara's army approached. They left. They were afraid. So, but the Buddha to be, right, he stayed. And Māra then said to his followers, "My men, there is no man equal to Siddhartha." Maybe I'll say Siddhartha, that's the word in Pali. It's Siddhartha in Sanskrit, Siddhartha in Pali. "My men, there is no man equal to Siddhartha, the son of Suddhodana. We are not equal to the task of giving him battle face to face. Let us attack him from behind." Like, wow. I like Māra. I tend to think of like he shows up, be like, nobody can stop me. But he's like, well, I'm a little bit concerned. So let's go around behind instead of this, I don't know, just a front, this battle that goes just straight on. And then here's something that's really interesting. Beholding the forces of Māra swooping down upon him from the north, the Bodhisattva continued to sit there, reflecting thus on the 10 perfections, the 10 parami. So the Buddha, he's thinking about the 10 parami. I put them in a list here. Many of you might be familiar with this list. So this is very different, right? In the suttas version, he's thinking about the 5 faculty. And here he's talking about the 10 parami. The 10 parami only appear in the absolute latest books of the Pali Canon. It's not in any of the primary suttas. It's not in any. It's not in the the 4 main books. It's not even in the. It's in, I think I put it in the notes in the Buddhavamsa. Yeah, I'm sorry. I put it in a footnote here, the exact which books it is, but it's in the Khuddaka Nikaya. So maybe I'll pause here. Does anybody have a comment so far? We're about to enter battle, but it's been set up. Definitely, it feels different, right, than what we saw yesterday. But I mean, this is definitely a big battle. Does somebody have, yes, Dave.
I'm struggling with the past Buddhas. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit late to ask this, but if we have a Buddha to be and past Buddhas, okay, where have the Buddhas been since? We refer to one Buddha. Uh, I'm not seeing much written on the Buddhas before, as opposed to the Buddha to be. Um, I've been studying this for a few years now, thinking of it in terms of just daily life.
Yeah.
And so I suppose maybe it's the math within. I'm not too much
Here,
into
I'll
metaphysics,
tell you about it.
but could you help me out with
Yeah,
past Buddhas, Buddha to versus Buddha to be?
yeah, yeah.
Thanks.
So this tradition, unlike the Mahayana tradition, so very different than Zen or Tibetan,
Mhm.
who believe there can be more than one Buddha at a time. This tradition, the Theravada or early Buddhism, I should say, says there can only be one Buddha at a time. And then the Buddha uh, gains awakening, teaches, and then the teachings die away. Maybe it's 1,000,000 years, maybe it's 1,000 years, whatever. And then another Buddha has to arise, learn things again, and teach
Oh,
those people, and then that ends. So does that help? Yeah, yeah. And then maybe I'll say there is a sutta, it's in the Digha Nikaya. I want to say, I think it's Digha 14, I'm not sure, that talks about this, about what the different Buddhas are. And they all have the same pattern. They all go sit underneath a tree, but it happens to be like a different type of tree. They all, have insights, and they all there's like a pattern that all Buddhas follow. So that's what the tradition is. But I think maybe I'll put your question or your comment into something I want to talk about later. it's so, I mean, it's fascinating for me. And here's this version of the story that has incredible amounts of hyperbole, right? Everything is so big and so much time and so much space, and this kind of and this idea of like, okay, not just one Buddha, but all these other ones behind before. We'll go through this, and then I want to talk a little bit like, okay, how do we work with this? How do we practice with it? And how can it be a support for practice, actually? Because many of us want to be like dismissive, like, okay, this is a little bit odd, and I don't know how to relate to this, or it feels completely irrelevant. But I think that there's some things here that can be helpful for us. Okay, so maybe I'll continue here. So the Buddha to be he's reflecting on the 10 perfections. So here's Māra, who wants to battle the Buddha. Then the Deva Puta Māra raised a tornado, wishing to drive away Siddhartha with it. Instantaneously, such gales rose from the east and other directions as would have shattered to bits mountain peaks of the height of half a yojana, 2 yojanas, or 3 yojanas, or could have uprooted shrubs and trees of the forest, or could have reduced to fragments the villages and townships in the neighborhood. But by the virtue and majesty of the great being, they lost their force. And on reaching the Bodhisattva, they were not able to shake even the hem of his robe. So here's something that could make mountains shake, but when they get to the Buddha, they can't. So we're not going to go through all of these, all what Māra hurls at the Buddha, but I made a little table here for us. So there's a tornado, it shows up as dry, as still air. There's heavy rainfall, it shows up as dryness. And then this is what I remember when I heard this story as, in Dharma talks, that rocks turned into flowers. These swords and daggers and all these things just turn into flowers. Perfume and gloom turns into sunlight, and this disc weapon turns into a canopy of garlands and more flowers too. So here's the Buddha. Everything comes towards them and they get transformed. So we're not going to go through every single version of that. And then this for me is very interesting. So after that, and the Buddha to be is still sitting there. So Māra advanced upon the Bodhisattva mounted on the back of the elephant Girimakala and cried out, "Rise, Siddhartha, from that seat. It is not meant for you. It goes to me." Like, wow. For me, it feels a little bit like jealousy or, something like this. Like, why would Māra think that he could get awakened? And why does he even want to become awakened? If he has dominion over samsara, why would he want to leave samsara? I don't know. I don't have answers to these questions, but it's kind of interesting for me. And then maybe I'll say this. I first became interested in this Māra story when I was at the Asian Art Museum here in San Francisco. Beautiful, amazing museum, giant museum, beautiful Asian art, lots, a whole section on Buddhas and, Southeast Asia, and as well as, Japan and, all parts of Asia. And there was this statue, or no, it wasn't a statue. It was like a piece that came off the side of a building or something. And it was depicting this battle with Māra. And then in the museum, they had this quote underneath it that was supposed to be from the suttas. And this, what I'm about to read, was the quote. Well, not exactly the quote, but similar. And I got so indignant. What? How dare they? This is wrong. It's not like this at all. They don't know what they're talking about. But So then I poked around and ended up discovering, oh, actually the museum had it right. All these Dharma teachers had been saying something different. So here we go. So the Buddha to be says to this, Māra, you have neither practiced the 10 perfections, the sub-perfections, and the supreme perfection, nor made the 5 great sacrifices, nor have you fulfilled the quest of knowledge, the quest of the wheel of the world, and the quest of wisdom. This seat is not meant for you. I alone have the right to it. Like, oh, so now there's this idea, this is what's required in order to become awakened. Perfection, sub-perfection, supreme perfection, sacrifices, and quests. Like this was really different than what we have heard. So we'll move on. And you can see I put some footnotes here to say what these sacrifices are. We won't talk about that so much right now. Then the great being told Māra, oh wait, maybe I should say what those sacrifices are. Here's footnote number 13. Pancha Mahaparichaga. It's not in the Pali Canon. Giving up wife, children, one's kingdom, and having a willingness to give up your limbs for the sake of others, and a willingness to give up their life for the sake of others. So these are the 5 great sacrifices that that the Buddha to be is saying is expected. And then the great being told Māra, as he stood there claiming the throne, accruing on the day of their enlightenment to bodhisattvas who fulfill their perfections, Māra, who will testify to your having given away in charity? Like what? Giving away in charity? You'll recognize that up here, way back up here, generosity is the first of the paramis. So, who will testify to your having given away in charity? Māra stretched forth his hand in the direction of this army, saying, all these are my witnesses. And they all said, we're your witness, I'm his witness. Okay. So everybody's vouching that Māra, in fact, has been very generous. And then Māra said to the great being, Siddhartha, who will testify to your having given in charity? The great being answered, you have sentient beings as witnesses to your having given away in charity. But here in this place, I have no living being, whatever is my witness. Remember, all the deities left before. Let alone that have, let's see, here in this place, I have no living being, whatever is my witness, let alone the generosity I have practiced in all the other existences, his past lives. Let this great and solid earth, non-sentient as it is, be my witness to the 700-fold great alms I gave when I was born as Vesantara. And extricating his right hand from underneath the folds of his robe, he stretched it out towards the earth, saying, are you or are you not witness to my having given the 700-fold alms in my birth as Vesantara? And the great earth resounded with 100, 1,000, or 100,000 echoes, as though to overwhelm the forces of Māra, and saying, as it were, I was your witness to it then. So this is very different, right? So, I mean, I think that if the Buddha that's at IMC has this depiction, right, of the Buddha touching the earth. This is such a common way in which we see the Buddhas. And then what I learned in Dharma talks is it was him saying that he had the right to become awakened. But here it's specifically about being generous. Generous in a previous life. And Vesantara, some of you might know, he gave the Buddha to be, who was Vesantara in a particular life, gave away his wife and children. Hence, sacrifice, doing one of these great sacrifices. So this is a lot. This is a lot. I'm going to stop sharing if I can figure out how to. Sometimes it's working with, I have, all these windows open, and here it is. And I'm sorry, I have a light on my face here, so I can remember. Does anybody have a comment about what we're encountering so far? Is anybody surprised? Yes. Yes.
One thing for me is I feel so touched by that, to hear that is about generosity to that level of compassion, of cutting it on lean for the well-being of others. So what I have understanding is that the when they say real compassion is that one that you risk your own life for the well-being of others. So I hear in that way, I don't know about cutting the limbs, but in our day-to-day life, how many people give organs for the well-being of others? So many ways that it can manifest to. That's all what is coming to my mind as I hear what is being. I don't know if I'm trying to avoid being the magnificence of this story, but nevertheless, this is very touching and very inspiring to go into, okay, how am I doing? How am I using this life to be on the path of generosity to that level?
Thank you. Thank you, Beth. Mm-hmm. Anybody else have a comment, something they'd like to say here? Marianne.
It's so there's such hyperbole here that it kind of stretches my willingness to believe it, and I'm not sure what it also is kind of reminds me kind of a little bit of like Christianity and some of the stories about the deities and what is some kind of like all powerful, something that runs throughout many different types of religions. Maybe it's and I'm interested in relating it to my life too.
Yeah, I'll talk about that, but it is quite something for me, because everything is so exaggerated. Like there's nothing here that's ordinary, right? Everything is big and stuff like this. I don't know. I'll just say I personally don't feel like this is. I have to believe this as a story that actually happened, but I think this story has a different function. And I'll talk about that when we finish the story. But the function is less to tell an accurate account of an event and more to support practitioners. This is how I'm holding it. Does anybody else have a?
I just have a general question. Is not the type of language used typical of the time? Grandiose, hyperbole.
Yeah, this is a really good question. So I would say yes, in that the commentaries, which are written in this era, and this is a commentary, yeah, they have a lot of supernatural elements. They have some exaggerated elements, and yeah, they definitely have a different flavor. Yeah, and even a sometimes different vocabulary too. Yeah, thank you, Midge, for asking that. Jerry.
When I first started to learn the dāna and some conversations like this, I was a little hypervigilant about hypocrisy, but now it doesn't bother me. So, but what I'm noticing is what the Buddha supposedly said to Māra does sound a little bit like adolescent boys fighting with each other, right? And it's like, excuse me, conceit is the last thing to go. You know, it is full of I'm better than you, which is conceit because it's comparative. And so I just now think, well, before that would just make me contract. And I knew the whole thing, every religion is full of crap, blah, blah, blah. But this time it doesn't really bother me. But it is sort of cute, I think, in in an adolescent way.
Yeah. And so, Jerry, could you imagine a function to have that of the Buddha to very explicitly make it clear that he's superior to Māra? Can you imagine that there's a function to that?
Well, I'm sure I'm about to learn one. I know they'll tell me, they'll share that. I just think it does make its point by one of the, conceit is supposed to be overcome at the end, right? Isn't that one of the last fetters to liberation?
Yeah, it's number 8. But
Right. So I'm still very focused in on this sort of, that's interesting that it also makes the Buddha more human, because even though, he's so great, he still has to make his greatness in comparison to to Māra seems a little petty, doesn't it?
But he's not awakened yet. We say, right, we haven't gotten to the awakening part, so maybe you're right. But there's a it's a rhetorical device, right? This is the commentaries, right? So these are 800 years after the time of the Buddha. And so they're wanting to show, like, there's competing religious ideas at this time, and they're wanting to show, oh, our religion's the best. Look, our guy beats everybody. And, this isn't unique to Buddhism. Every single religion does this. By definition, in order to justify their existence, they have to be better than every other religious or spiritual tradition. Otherwise, right, no, they just wouldn't exist. So it's, and we see this a lot in the suttas, primarily like in the Digha Nikaya. And this isn't something that if you listen to Dharma talks, you would hear about because it's not so inspiring, and Dharma teachers aren't going to share those passages. But it's definitely all throughout the suttas. The way that I'm characterizing it is like, our guy's the best. And it doesn't matter like who else, who he gets compared to. And so it's just a rhetorical device, I would say, in literature, you could say, as opposed to a recording of an actual event. Whereas the suttas, right, they're supposed to be closer to what's actually happened. And now we're talking to 800 years later, they're recounting their version of what happened. Is that helpful, Jerry, or is it?
I think it's common to your response is I mean, it really is not a big deal to me that there may be even some hypocrisy, because there's 1,001 reasons and or excuses that, and the stuff is pretty old and it's been passed on through people who maybe thought that they were special because they were passing, the conceit is is one of the last things to go. So it doesn't surprise me or bother me.
Nice.
To call it a literary device, maybe it is, but it's a strange literary device for a philosophy that downplays or that emphasizes how conceit is a hindrance and an obstacle to our full potential, in this case of compassion or so. But it's not that, it's really, believe it or not that important.
Yeah, and something else it brings up is, what is our relationship to these texts? What authority do we give them? And when what's in the text doesn't jive with what our understanding of the teachings, it's inconsistent with our experience, it's something different than what our teacher has told us, then what do we do with them? And this is, I think, is really the interesting question, is what role do these sacred, quote unquote, they're only sacred because a community of people decided that they were. And so what's our relationship with them? What role do they have in our practice? Because there will be conflicts, guaranteed, between what your teacher says and your experience, or your experience and what the sutta says, or, so how do we hold that? How do we work with that? And for me, I think that this is probably the most interesting question. It's like, okay, yeah, what is authoritative? What points the way, or what validates, or, something like this, something like this.
Since you brought it up in that way, one of that pulled me in a lot was Buddha Dasa's sort of condemnation of what Buddhaghosa did to the teachings. I think he called them names and everything. And in other words, but to me, that gave me permission to be a little skeptical.
Yeah.
Not that I'm at the level of Buddhadasa, but Buddhadasa really goes after, this guy who added all this stuff to the teachings. And recently I heard Suchita sort of set up sort of some absurdity that he went back to. We don't really know what the Buddha taught, and it was the commentaries, and there was a lot of, if you play the telephone game, nothing ever ends up even close sometimes to what the original message was. Nonetheless, I think that there's so many of us who have found how to use the Dharma for our own growth and development, and that's the bottom line, right? Yeah. And Suchita calls it, I don't know why this sticks with me as so simple, because I do see it, experience it, the ripening effect.
Nice.
Yeah, that would go with Gil's teachings also, that it's not a direct, it's all of a sudden, gee, I would have never done that before. It's and you feel good about it, and it's ripening. So I like that. And the rest of it is a little bit being obsessive compulsive.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we'll get back to our story here. So the Buddha touches the earth. The earth is the witness that he has been generous, like super generous as can be. And then when this happens, Mara's followers all leave. They run in every direction. And all the heavenly beings, they are very happy. Māra has been defeated. Prince Siddhartha has triumphed. Let us honor him at his victory. And they drew near the great being, going up to his Bodhi seat. And they thus advanced singing, for this is the victory to the illustrious Buddha and defeat to Māra the evil one. I'm a little bit confused about this. I didn't look up the Pali for this. I should have. Why he's not a Buddha yet, right? He's just won this battle with Māra. He's not awakened. He's just won this battle, but they're calling him a Buddha here. So there's all these heavenly beings that are very happy. And then the remaining deities of the 10,000 world system stood there honoring him with garlands and perfumes and ointments and singing his praises in diverse ways. So a lot of adulation, a lot of devotion happening for having defeated the wicked one. Something like this, we could consider that Māra is what gets in the way with people leaving samsara and becoming awakened. And then here is where the Buddha becomes awakened. In the first watch of the night, which some people would say that's from, I think it's 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. In the first watch of the night, he entered into the knowledge of previous existences. This is just like we saw in the sutta I said earlier. In the second watch of the night, he purified his divine eye. That is the second knowledge too. It's often called the divine eye that allows you to see where different beings get reborn. And in the final watch of the night, he entered into the knowledge of dependent origination. Like, what? Wait, this is different. Then, as he was contemplating the 12-fold structure of conditions in terms of the cycle of continuation and the cessation of the cycle in both forward and reverse order, the 10,000 world system up to the water's edge quaked 12 times. Okay, so the third knowledge is dependent origination. Then, at dawn, when the great being had gained penetrative insight into omniscient knowledge, making the 10,000 world systems resound, the entire 10,000 worlds assumed a festive garb. 4 knowledges instead of 3, what we usually see. And the fourth one is omniscience, or it's called omniscience. And I did look up the polythus. It's all knowledge is how it literally is. It's getting translated here as omniscience. It's fascinating. This is, for me, it's very fascinating that the Buddha, I mean, he becomes a being who has complete omniscience or knows everything, or I don't know how, there's different ways to understand omniscience, but it's not something that we usually hear being batted around in the Pali Canon and in the way that we think of, like we're striving for something like awakening or enlightenment. This idea that we want to become omniscient is something very different, I would say. So I'm going to stop share there, and then this is in the Google folder that you guys that was sent last week. And this is an excerpt from the entire Nidana. I don't know. I don't remember how many pages, 40, 50, 60 pages or something. So this is just this little bit here. And does anybody have some comments about this idea of the deities honoring the Buddha and the devotion? For me, it feels kind of sweet, actually. There's something, this recognition of, okay, he became awakened, and the world noticed. Yes, Sarah.
It sounded very much like some biblical passages of the Old and New Testament, as the angels surrounding God, and the omniscience part. I mean, that is one of the qualities of the Jewish and Christian God, is omniscient. He's omniscient. He's everywhere. He knows everything. He sees into our hearts, all of that. So, as you were saying earlier, maybe all religions eventually end up needing an omniscient God, because I mean the Buddha says there is no omniscient God. So it's kind of seems to be I don't know,
A head scratcher.
Definitely, it's poetic. It's definitely poetic. It's and maybe in terms of competitive religion at that time, it required to use some of these same metaphors and poetry. But it's interesting. What does it do for us practitioners? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll talk about this in a moment. But I can imagine many of you here are thinking like, but many of us are convert Buddhists, right? We didn't grow up Buddhist, and we grew up probably in a Judeo-Christian setting. I don't know if that's true for everybody, but it's true for many of us. And there's a way that there could be part of like, well, wait, I left that behind, and I wanted something that seemed a little more believable. And this idea of, ehipassiko, come and see for yourself. Well, how would, there's no way for us to know anything about this for ourselves in this kind of way. So I do want to, maybe I'll just talk a little bit about some of these things that are different. And we've already pointed to this, but I want to highlight them again, because we'll talk about, is there a way in which we could make this relevant for ourselves? But first, I just want to highlight, we could say there's a number of awe-inspiring elements. So this is 800 years, supposedly, after the time of the Buddha. And this is a long time ago, right before they understood the world in the way that we understand it now. So this this idea of this epic that's happening, there's this this large, everything's like bigger than life type of thing. I wonder if you know, that was part of storytelling. Yeah, that was, you know, part of the, as Midge pointed out earlier, like maybe this is kind of how the literature and communication or stories were at that time. It's also this idea of the offerings. I didn't read all of it, but the Dāna Kata is replete with lots of offerings that it's fascinating for me that there's songs of praise and flowers and perfumes that are made by deities and by humans. We didn't see it in this excerpt, but in other places. And it's just devotion for the sake of devotion. Like they're not asking a deity to intercede on their behalf or something like this, right? It's just praise and devotion. It's pointing to something very different. Whereas in early Buddhism, there's a lot of talk, you know, to understand and to meditate and to practice. But here is more of a heart-centered, and maybe even this ties in with generosity and being with supporting other beings. This is more of this heart-centered. And it's fascinating that in the Dāna Kata, we don't hear anything about meditation. We don't hear anything about, you know, supposedly the past life, that earlier in that same life, he had done all these austerities or anything like this. And there's maybe I also wanted to mention, we've often heard the story of Sujata, the woman who brings milk rice to the Buddha as he's right before he makes his final quest. And that's here in the Dāna Kata. I didn't include it, but it's here too. Not in the nice, neat and tidy way that we might think it is. It's kind of an interesting story, but it's in there. And then there's also like miracles, right? Even the silly thing like the Buddha had some grass and then he tossed it down and it made a platform 21 feet wide with this fantastic pattern. Like, why would they be what we would call miracles or magic or something for something that seems so inconsequential? And then maybe, lastly, I'll say here that this idea of the paramis, the perfections, used as a shield, as a protection against difficulties or against being assaulted, you know, by whatever one is experiencing, is something that we see here in the Dāna Kata. So let's talk about how this could be relevant to our practice.
Could I say something? And maybe
yes.
it might come a question, I don't know. When I hear that, that feels so magic, and I never thought, so I'm grateful to hear as a possibility of being more a way of telling stories to use, because so far I have been seeing it almost from the indigenous perspective. when I take in consideration that in those times, but that was very much free, or what we understand the world to be right now, where people were very connected to the land and seeing death and seeing the deterioration and needing to plant and rely on the season. So this brings so much connection to earth. And in many indigenous language, and I just want to say that is it's part of my ancestry to see in this way, to be able to speak in sounds like a magic way, but it's really pointing to some beauty that happens within the heart when it has a clear position or determination or affirmation, and be able to give this body and this life force to manifest that inner beauty externally. So I'm just curious to try to read it as just a way of speaking that is metaphoric, but for me, I still have that lens, and I'm happy to question that lens too. But it feels very much the language that I hear from the indigenous, from the elders, from the land, always talking in that way. So didn't come any question, but it's just I feel that is I am moved by this thing to express that way.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Beth. And there's a way, right? I'm trained as a scientist and I feel like, okay, where's the data? You know, we have all this. So I'm bringing a bias here, and I'm so happy that you brought this up to kind of like highlight the bias that I'm bringing here. But I also am touched by it. But I will say that I wasn't the first time I heard it. The first time I heard it, I was like, what? What? Where was the Buddhism that I fell in love with that felt so practical and good and pragmatic? You know, here's things to do. So thank you, Beth. I appreciate very much you bringing that in. Jerry.
I know nothing about this except my memory, and I looked it up just now quickly. Joseph, was it Campbell? I mean, his study in
myth.
Yeah, that the myths of many cultures, I think over many hundreds or thousands of years, he, according to him, had very common themes. So
Yes.
yeah, so that's interesting. And then I'm not really big on my religious studies or biblical studies, but I do feel as if the supreme being in at least the Old Testament was rather punitive and very punishing. And I don't know the New Testament very well, if at all. And supposedly Christ was not like that. But the Buddha clearly is there any story where the Buddha like retaliated with special powers? Not that I'm aware of. No. And when the people were those monks, I love that. I don't remember where that's from, but when they were fighting, he sort of realized there isn't that much he could do at the moment, you know. And he didn't punish them. That was so his role is really different than the Judeo-Christian type of like supreme being.
Yeah. Thank you for highlighting that. Like, there's no right. He's not causing harm. Yeah. Well, he does call somebody like, you foolish person, you know, so he does that. So, but that's just language that he's pointing to. He's not, you know, causing physical harm or something like this. And this idea about mythology and common things, that's exactly where I want to go next. So I want to, I'll share here. We'll go back to some of these slides here. Okay, so we're not going to talk about all of this, but what are the functions of myths? If we're going to put this into the category of a myth, because it has this epic tone, it has this, the hyperbole, the supernatural, all these things. we're not going to go through all these details here, but psychological function that represents inner truths or archetypes of the human psyche, which helps individuals navigate personal growth, transformation, and the journey of life. I'm going to spend a little bit more time with that in the ensuing slides, but I also want to just touch on these others. Maybe the kind of like explanatory, cosmological, like what is the origin of the world? Because especially this is really powerful 1,000 years ago. And maybe it helps people to understand some of the, or yeah, feel like they understand and put into context birth and death and the beginnings and endings and these types of things. Also a sociocultural function that myths kind of like establish a group identity. And like, okay, these are myths often are they're pointing to values that get shared. Like this one with Māra is this value of, having some steadfastness and determination and not being won over, what's the expression? Not losing a battle to Māra, which is like delusion and these types of things. So reinforces shared values and group identity. Theological or spiritual, the relationship between humans and the divine or the sacred. And maybe it also provides language for people to talk about their experience in a way that's not the usual way we talk about it, because maybe their experiences don't fit well into the usual language. And this is not uncommon for people to, in my role as a Dharma teacher, for people to, like when they're something really that's touched them deeply, an experience that they've had, that they're kind of like stumbling around trying to find language for it or something. And maybe some of these myths are somebody is creating language in which people could express some of the things that happen. And then, of course, it's just narrative, stories, entertaining, inspiring, or maybe meaning, something like this. So now having this kind of, just the broad brush about myths is how can we apply that to this story of with Māra? Myth as a mirror. I like this expression. The symbolic map of the inner life. So maybe the Buddha to be under the Bodhi tree represents something for us, the seeker, or some inner resolve, this determination, or stillness, clarity, or steadfastness, or the one that is yearning for freedom. Maybe there's a way in which hearing these stories, it speaks to a part of us that maybe we haven't fully acknowledged or fully integrated or allowed to be as full as it wants to be, something like this. So the Buddha to be under, so maybe in this story, it represents something for us in our inner life. And then we could say that Māra, of course, represents the wish to control. We like to control other people, we like to control ourselves, but also the delusion, thinking that we can control. And also maybe there's this fear, doubt, or craving, or even the inner saboteur. Or maybe the Māra is not wicked, but maybe that part of us that's wounded or afraid or unacknowledged. So, maybe Māra, was afraid that the Buddha was going to leave his control, but maybe there's a way in which we have this fear and we're just trying to like find something stable to hold on to. And maybe Māra is part of this too. Fear and delusion, craving. And then we could also say that the earth as witness, like touching the earth as part of the awakening story, represents maybe like stability or groundedness, or the practice of turning to something other than just more effort. Sometimes when we are practicing, we feel like we just have to strive harder. But here we see the Buddha saying, well, the earth is my witness. The earth is actually going to support me here. So what do you guys think about this as one way to consider this? So there's maybe these different elements in this myth can represent parts of our inner life, right? This isn't the only way to interpret it. It's one way to interpret it. Does anybody have some comments or some thoughts about this? Do you think it's helpful? Was it for me when I saw this and thought about it, and I found it helpful, actually, just to say, oh yeah, sometimes there is this yearning for freedom, and sometimes there is determination, and not all the time. Sometimes there isn't too, but just found it helpful to like, oh yeah, maybe there's a Buddha to be in all of us. Dave.
When you went through that slide with the myths as they relate to the Buddha, it looked all the world to me like someone who's going to be successful PhD candidate. It's steadfast, you're open to learning, you're not only suspending disbelief, but not passing immediate judgment. It took me sometimes 2 to 3 years to fully grasp an idea in mathematics. And it became, and some of them, sometimes that closeness and understanding develops over decades. So I see it as, in fact, it also brings to mind the fifth hindrance, the skepticism. Is, again, not to just suspend disbelief, but to suspend judgment. Earlier you asked, how does this relate to my current practice? I'll be thinking about this for a while. I'm not about to make a judgment as to how it fits in today or how it might fit in this week. It's just one of those things that I'm really enjoying. And aside, I greatly appreciate what others have said here. The comments that, let's see, Midge, Beth, Jerry have just been really, really illuminating, very helpful. You're good too. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dave. That was sweet. Fantastic. Fantastic. Anybody else have something they'd like to share?
When I look at the things that Māra has, they look like character traits that I possess.
Mm-hmm. All of us. Mm-hmm.
And the interaction between the Buddha and the Buddha to be and Māra is instructive for me in ways that I can understand simply. That is very difficult for me to do at times in my practice. But to recognize them as parts of the way I express in the world. And I don't know if you said this or I heard it someplace else, but I thought we see last week that Māra does not harm the Buddha. And the Buddha does not harm Mara either. So those are instructive ways of looking at my practical life and my practice.
Beautiful. Yeah, I don't think I said that last week, but it's beautiful, Midge. Thank you for highlighting that. That there isn't harm. There's this battle, right? But there's not harm. Yeah, yeah. Beautiful. Thank you, Midge. And I like also that you said about you kind of like simplifies things in some kind of a way too, which can be helpful. It's funny that while, I've been preparing for these or reading something like this, I don't know, I found myself a little bit more steadfast. It's funny. I didn't intend to, right? It just like, I felt it just ended up happening that I was just a little more stick-to-itiveness was showing up as having been thinking about this story for these days. Yeah. Rajesh.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'd like to just say something which is coming from a totally different perspective, because my impression is we are thinking of Māra as an external event. It's something but it could all be an internal event, because if you look at some of the Indian traditions, having visions and things like that is very, very common. And if you look at, if you listen to the people who've had these visions, they tend to be consistent with their cultural background, right? So if you're from a Catholic background, you have, Christ. And if you are from a Hindu background, you might have Mother Kali, or in other words, the tradition you're in affects the kind of visions you have. So this could entirely be an internal process.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be an external process. And the second thing I'd just like to mention, when they talk about the earth shaking or, all things trembling and things like that in some of the other parts, there is in the various Indian traditions, and some of you may have heard of it, something called the Kundalini.
Yeah.
And when the Kundalini rises, right, one of the consequences is, or one of the symptoms of the Kundalini rising could be the body shaking and everything shaking. And it's very consistent. The stories that you're talking about are very consistent with those traditions. So it's quite possible that this is all a description of an internal process. And then even the shaking and the trembling is consistent with the traditions, and which are still true. Those traditions are still true. In other words, they're still followed, and people teach Kundalini yogas and things like that. So I just wanted to share that as a different perspective.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rajesh. And we had talked about before, it was internal, but I hadn't thought about like Kundalini with earth shaking. And Rajesh, do you have an idea? Like there's a lot of the main devotion, right? There's singing and there's giving gifts of flowers and garlands. Like, how might we understand that as an internal thing? Do you have a sense?
Yes, because in a sense, it is generosity, right? And the giving of things to God, right? And so as an example, you can think of prayer and the giving of offerings and things like that as an act of generosity. And very often people will make all these gifts to, let's say, the temple and things like that. Very often, if it's food and money, it is very often distributed to the poor people. So it really is a continuation of that particular process.
I see. But it occurs to me also, just building on your theme of an internal, maybe in the moment, maybe it's a way of letting go. It's like sometimes we have this idea like to give up, like to put up on the altar is like to a certain amount of letting go. So maybe the deities giving the flowers and these types of things is a letting go happening. That's happening. A surrender.
Oh, you mean, I see. I'm sorry, I didn't understand your question or what you were talking about before. I misunderstood it. But yes, you're absolutely right.
Very
and
nice.
That could be an internal process where the person is giving up. I thought you were really talking about people making offering. I didn't, quite catch
Yeah. I understood that you didn't understand.
Yeah, but no, you're absolutely right. It could just be a giving up of everything that you have
Yeah, very
as
nice.
an internal process.
Hmm.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Rajesh. Anybody else have some comments they'd like to share here? Yes, Jerry.
One of the draws into Buddhism, although I sort of resisted it for a good part of my life, was is the notion that we could all become Buddhas, so that there's no, and I don't know how practical that is, but it's a nice invitation and I'm sure we've all had a moment, even if it's very brief, where there's nothing that can disturb our inner peace that's based on compassion and love for humanity. So we've touched it, and what Buddha Dasa, to go back to him, he has a nice little very short article on, that nirvana is visit, we've been in nirvana even very temporarily. I forget the way he describes it, throughout our lifetime. So, and also the omniscient thing, was it omniscience? Yeah. I had narcissistic type fantasies of omniscience, or more of omnipotence than omniscience. But I have to say that and I'm not at all versed in this, so I don't want to give a false impression. But in moments of, I refuse to use the word concentration, in moments of integration, in moments of inner unity, this has happened recently. I sort of feel as if, not that I know everything, but that it's there. I don't have it in me to want to know everything, but there's a sense of not an expand, not of, I don't know how to explain it actually. But there's a sense that, and that haven't other philosophers or talked about some of that now, all of the knowledge is already there. It's just a matter of accessing it, right? I don't know who else talks like that, but there seems to be experientially some sense of, wow, where's this stuff coming from in me? And it's
Very
not
nice.
me. I realize it's not me. And when I look at the dog, and then where did the dog's knowledge come, instincts and knowledge come from? The dog, for those of us who have pets, I didn't teach him half of the survival skills that he came with.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So there's, and I used to always reject that genetically we could pass down knowledge, but we do pass down something that looks like knowledge, survival value. So.
Okay. Yeah. So this idea, what is omniscience and what is knowledge? Yeah. Yeah. What does even omniscience mean? Yeah. Nice. Nice. Thank you, Jerry. Well, maybe we'll end with, I'll just share a few small teachings that are in the suttas. We're back now to the suttas, where the Buddha speaks about how to work with Māra. So let's see here. So this one, I chose this one because it's it feels like it goes a little bit with the four knowledges here. One who has ended the defilement of sensuality, whose ignorance has faded away, and whose desire to be reborn is finished, liberated, free of attachments, they bear their final body, having vanquished Māra and his mount. So this is in the Itivuttaka. So we see here that these are the taints, right? The sensuality, ignorance, and to bear their final body, that means to be awakened. If you're completely awakened, you're not reborn. And so that's one way it gets defined. So then here's just another short little verse. Like a fish pulled from the sea and cast upon the shore, this mind flounders about trying to throw off Māra's dominion. So again, kind of like pointing to that this Māra is an internal experience. And I love this, the visual, like a fish floundering about, right? Like this unorganized, desperate sense of not being methodical or careful, or desperateness. And that's from the Dhammapada. And then I'll share this last one. I should say there's a number of them, and next week I'll share some more. But here's another one. Whoever has well-developed ethics, samadhi, and wisdom has slipped free of Māra's dominion and shines like the sun. Ittaputaka 59. Some of you will recognize this Sila Samadhi Panya, ethics, samadhi, wisdom. This is, we could say, just a summary of the entire Buddhist path, and like the Eightfold Path and the gradual training. And so if you develop the Eightfold Path, you slip free of Māra's dominion and shines like the sun. So this, for me, this one kind of like just brings it really home. Like, okay, this is stuff we practice. We are developing ethics, samadhi, and wisdom with our practice. And this is related to being free from Māra's dominion. So maybe tying together some of this, maybe more in the mind in some kind of way, what we've been talking about, this story and mythology. And here, this is bringing it back to, okay, here's often what we're doing with our life is to help us with this story as well. Okay, well, here we are at the end of our time together. Thank you, everybody. It's fun exploring this with you all. And next week, we'll look at the Buddha Charita, which is has a completely different flavor. It's poetry, and it's epic poetry. So it has this little bit of this hyperbole flavor, but there's a lot of emotion in it. It's very I don't know. I really enjoy it. I think it's a lot of fun. So that's what we'll do next week. So thank you all, and hope to see you next week. And if you like, you're welcome to unmute, and we could all say goodbye together. So,
Bye.
bye, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Diana. It was lovely.
Everybody.
Thank you, everybody, for being
you.
here.
Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing this.